Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. To understand what truly drove men to cross oceans and commit atrocities in the name of trade, you have to first grasp what they were actually trading for. The spices of the East were not mere condiments. They were currency. They were medicine. They were, in the minds of those who pursued them, the distilled essence of everything the world had to offer that was worth having. And among all the spices that moved men to madness, none was more prized than nutmeg. Just for a second, think about the numbers, because numbers have a way of clarifying what words sometimes obscure. In the 17th century, a quantity of nutmeg that a man might hold in his closed fist was worth more than he could earn in a year of honest labor. Pound for pound, it surpassed in value almost every other commodity on earth. To offer a comparison today that requires no scholarly apparatus, the nutmeg of 1600 stood in relation to ordinary trade goods roughly as cocaine stands in relation to the commerce of today, which is to say, it's worth a great deal. It attracted the wrong sort of attention, and men were prepared to do extraordinary things to acquire it. Torture among those things, murder, certainly. Small wonder then that the contest between the two great trading empires of the age, the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company, turns ultimately not upon maps or treaties or even the magnificent calculations of Amsterdam's financiers, but upon this modest dried kernel, the one rattling quietly in the corner of your kitchen cupboard. The nutmeg plant itself grew in those years almost exclusively on a small cluster of islands at the far eastern reaches of the Indonesian archipelago, the Banda Islands. Nature, I think, had been very generous with the spice and thoroughly inconvenient about its geography. To reach it required crossing the better part of the known world, and those who controlled it from the source, controlled a commodity that European physicians credited with powers that strained credulity even in an age not noted for its skepticism. It cured dysentery, they said, the bloody flux that swept through the armies and cities that the medical profession had no reliable means of treating. It settled troubled stomachs. It purified the blood. And in sufficient quantities, it produced the effects that might charitably be described as visionary. And most importantly of all, most profitably of all, it was claimed to offer protection against the plague. In a city like London, where the pestilence returned generation after generation and cut its swathe through rich and poor, I have to say, with equal appetite, this last claim was worth more than gold. Physicians prepared aromatic concoctions, nosegays, and nasal caps stuffed with herbs and spices, and of course, nutmeg being considered the vital ingredient. Whether any of these preparations worked is a question the evidence answers rather cruelly. That people believed they worked is beyond dispute, and belief in these matters of commerce is frequently more powerful than the truth. Such was the commodity at the heart of the contest between two of the most powerful commercial organizations that the world had ever produced. So where we left them in the last podcast, in the account that just preceded this one, at a particular moment, it was 1602. The Dutch had invented the tradable share. They'd built the world's first stock exchange, and they outfinanced the English East India Company by a margin that actually made comparison almost embarrassing. They had arrived in Asian waters, set up their fortified headquarters on Java, and they were ready to take what they had come for. And it had come to rest alongside the English counterpart in the waters off Batavia, the city the Dutch were remaking as their eastern capital, which the world would come to know as Jakarta. I think what followed would change the history of trade, of empire, and in ways that surprised nearly everyone involved, the history of a small island on the other side of the world that the Dutch would exchange for a piece of land in North America. And that island was Manhattan. The deal that transferred it was one of the most consequential commercial arrangements of the 17th century. And it was made possible, indeed made necessary, by everything that had come before, by the wars and the monopolies and the massacres and the mercantile calculations and the desperate hunger for a very small aromatic kernel that a man might carry in his pocket without even noticing the weight. The story, in other words, was only just beginning. The masks that the Venetians wore, those beaky, those extraordinary kind of beaked contraptions, half nightmare and half theater, well, believe it or not, they were actually practical instruments, or so their wearers believed. The beaks were hollow. They were packed with aromatic herbs and spices. And among those spices was nutmeg, and that was considered the essential ingredient, the one that made the difference between life and death when the plague hit your city. That it did absolutely nothing of the sort. Posterity established with rather more certainty than the physicians of the age could manage. But belief, as has been observed, is frequently worth more in commercial terms than the truth. It always has been. And there was no shortage of credible witnesses prepared to swear by nutmeg's miraculous properties. And just to name one of the most famous ones, Samuel Pepys. Pepys was not a man given to false modesty. And if you want to find out more about him, I actually did a complete podcast on Pepys and his diaries and the hidden meaning behind them. So if you're interested in going a little bit in depth, then I urge you to go back and listen to that particular podcast. Pepys actually recorded his conviction that nutmeg had preserved him during outbreaks that carried off neighbors and acquaintances with distressing regularity. He was, in the language of a later and more kind of image-conscious age, exactly the sort of influential figure whose endorsement made a luxury commodity indispensable to those who could afford it. He was the David Beckham of his day. And of course, he made these commodities irresistible to those who couldn't. His diary, well, there were numerous diaries, and they all still survive, contain an account that captures the nutmeg trade, I think, at its most vivid. So late one evening, he makes his way down to the docks. He's wearing a cape. He's got a hat on. It's probably a foggy night. By his own account, something very close to a black market transaction takes place. Gold coins changed hands in the darkness. A weathered sea dog pressed into his hand a very tiny sack of nutmeg. And the exchange had about it the furtive quality, I guess, of commerce that knows it's being watched and prefers not to be, which, given the value of what was changing hands, was entirely understandable. For nutmeg's extraordinary price was inseparable from its extraordinary scarcity, and that scarcity was inseparable from its geography. In the 1600s, nutmeg grew in only one place on Earth, not a country, not one region, one archipelago of islands, the Banda Islands, a scattering of volcanic peaks rising from the Banda Sea, which sat 1,200 miles east of Java and roughly 600 miles west of Australia. Papua New Guinea was the nearest landmass of any consequence. And keep in mind that Australia and Papua New Guinea hadn't even been discovered by this stage. So to reach the Banda Islands in the 17th century aboard a wooden vessel crossing seas that offered no mercy to the unprepared, well, it was an undertaking that combined genuine navigational skill with a tolerance for complete catastrophe that most men didn't possess. The storms alone were sufficient to destroy an expedition. The monsoons imposed their own schedule on any captain foolish enough to ignore them. Sunken reefs lay in wait below surfaces that looked deceptively navigable. And look, if the elements weren't enough to discourage enough, a merchant sailing for the Band Islands also had to contend with the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, none of whom had any intention of permitting a rival to share what they regarded as their exclusive inheritance. The monopoly on nutmeg wasn't merely a commercial arrangement. It was a strategic objective for which men had died and would die again. The isolation of these islands wasn't an accident of nature that the great trading powers mourned. It was a fact of geography that they quietly celebrated. Nature, for its part, had made that monopoly even more difficult to break than it might otherwise have appeared. The nutmeg tree wasn't the sort of plant that rewarded impatience. From planting to first fruit, it required between 6 and 9 years of careful cultivation. Unlike tea, which ambitious colonial powers could transplant by stealing a cutting and, establishing a plantation elsewhere, nutmeg actually demanded time that most schemes of commercial piracy couldn't afford. You couldn't seize a handful of seedlings and return home expecting to profit within a year or two. The tree's actual requirements were equally unforgiving. It actually needed a very precise volcanic soil of a particular composition and I have to say, a microclimate that the Band Islands provided and that almost nowhere else on Earth could replicate with sufficient reliability. Every attempt to cultivate nutmeg beyond those few islands met with failure or something sufficiently close to failure as to make no commercial difference. The Band Islands didn't merely happen to grow nutmeg. They were, as far as the plant was concerned, the only place that it could grow. If you've never seen a nutmeg tree, it's absolutely beautiful in the way that valuable things so often are. It resembles a lemon tree. It's slender and elegant, hung with fruit of a similar color. It's a pale golden yellow that ripens under the island sun. And when you split it to reveal the nutmeg, well, you crack open that fruit and you peel away the flesh. And what you find is a small wizened nut, the nutmeg itself, encased in something altogether very much more striking. It's a bright red lacework of membrane, intricate as embroidery, and it's clinging to the shell. And that embroidery is actually mace. So nutmeg and mace, they're twin products of a single extraordinary tree, both prized, both profitable, both dependent on 6 islands in the middle of one of the world's most dangerous seas. And it's upon this foundation, fragile, remote, and ferociously defended, that 2 of the greatest commercial empires of the age would construct their ambitions and eventually their wars. Every part of the nutmeg fruit is put to use. The mace found its way into spice markets and kitchens with equal readiness. The golden flesh of the fruit made preserves and chutneys, on the islands where it actually grew. A domestic economy running quietly beneath the great commercial dramas that the fruit actually provoked elsewhere. As for those islands themselves, a sailor approaching them for the first time received a kind of sensory introduction that no account, however accurate, has quite prepared him for. The Band Islands in the 17th century were covered from shore to summit in groves of nutmeg trees, dense forests of them, entire hillsides given over to the cultivation of a single plant. The sight would have been remarkable, and I think what preceded it was more remarkable still. Before a ship's lookout could actually make out the shape of land against the horizon, the sea air would change. The breeze carried something off those islands, a fragrance, if you like, a warm and complex, unmistakable fragrance, the concentrated scent of nutmeg hanging over open water like an invitation or a warning depending upon the nature of the vessel that received it. Sailors who had spent weeks crossing open ocean and seeing nothing but waves, well, they suddenly found themselves breathing in the perfume of a cargo that they had actually risked their lives to acquire. It was, I think, by all accounts, an extraordinary moment, and as we'll discover, an extraordinarily dangerous one. For the beauty of the Band Islands and the value of what they produced had attracted precisely the kind of attention that makes beauty dangerous. The monopoly on nutmeg wasn't merely worth defending, it was worth fighting for, and it was absolutely worth killing for. And to understand why, you only need to examine the arithmetic. At the source, at the quayside of the Band Islands themselves, in the shade of those fragrant groves, less than 1 English penny would purchase 10 pounds of nutmeg, so effectively an entire sack. A modest sum for a considerable quantity of one of the most sought-after substances on Earth. That same quantity, carried alive across 3 years and the better part of the world's oceans, would sell in the streets of London for something in the region of £2 and 10 shillings. That markup was in the order of 60,000%. Sit with that number just for a moment. So a man who returned from the Band Islands with even a modest hold full of nutmeg had not merely done well. He had secured himself and his investors a fortune that a lifetime of ordinary trade would actually struggle to match. And the mechanism by which this extraordinary differential was produced, well, it wasn't difficult to understand, even if its consequences were difficult to justify. Nutmeg in the ordinary course of trade would have passed through 5 sets of hands before it reached a customer in Northern Europe. And let's just walk through that. Island traders carried it to Sumatra. Indian merchants carried it west to the Malabar coast. Arab sailors then took it up the Red Sea to Cairo. The Venetians, who had made themselves indispensable middlemen between East and West, then carried it to their city, which was for generations the spice capital of Europe. There, the English and the Dutch and the Portuguese bought it for whatever price the Venetians cared to charge. And at each stage of that journey, the price roughly doubles or trebles or worse. 5 sets of hands, 5 separate levies, 5 opportunities effectively for the men who moved the spice to exact their due. By the time nutmeg completed the journey from the groves of Banda to the apothecaries and the kitchens of London, it had been taxed by distance and by intermediaries until its original cost bore no recognizable relation to its final price. And I guess the solution would have been obvious to anyone willing to contemplate the risks. Sail directly to the Band Islands, purchase the nutmeg at source, carry it home, cut out every middleman along that chain from island to market, and claim for yourself the profits that 5 sets of intermediaries had been quietly dividing for generations. The voyage would effectively take 3 years. It would cross seas that killed men with democratic indifference and require navigating monopolies enforced with military force. It demanded courage, capital, and a certain comfortable relationship with the idea that, well, some ventures fail entirely. But look, for those who succeeded, for those who rounded the Cape, for those who crossed the Indian Ocean, found the Band Islands through the scented air, loaded their hold, and brought it all home, well, that reward was transformative. Not merely profitable, transformative. Which is why men kept going despite everything the oceans and their rivals could do to stop them. This, then, was the essential truth, I think, behind everything that followed. The Band Islands weren't merely valuable. They were the monopoly-made flesh. Whoever controlled those 6 volcanic specks controlled the entire global supply of nutmeg. All of it. Every pound that reached Europe, every ounce that found its way into an apothecary's jar or a nobleman's kitchen came from those 6 islands and nowhere else. Control them, and you controlled the fortune. And it was a proposition of elegant simplicity. And it was this simplicity, I think, that made the contest for the Band Islands one of the most consequential and one of the most violent commercial struggles of the 17th century. Both the English East India Company and the Dutch VOC had established what they called factories on the island of Java, fortified warehouses that served their respective headquarters in the east. And the word factory, well, it's a euphemism. They were armed compounds, bases of operation from which men with money and men with weapons pursued, sometimes simultaneously, the same objectives. The port of Bantam, a short distance down the coast from what would become Jakarta, was where both powers had dug themselves in, each watching the other with the attentive wariness of rivals who know that they are playing for the same prize. And I think even at this early stage, the balance of strength, well, it was never in question. The Dutch possessed more ships. They had mobilized more capital. They could put more men in the field. And as events would make clear, they were considerably more willing to use them. The English East India Company was a formidable institution in London. However, in the eastern waters, it was operating in the shadow of a far larger and better funded, more ruthless rival. From Bantam, both companies sailed east into the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. Some islands yielded cinnamon and cloves, others produced nutmeg and nothing else. To those latter islands, the most determined men sailed, and I think the most desperate competition was drawn. Of course, the Dutch arrived first. Their response to this geographical advantage was characteristically Dutch. They built forts, their fortifications they raised on the Band Islands in the early decades of the 17th century, well, they still stand. You can go there today and still see them. They're crumbling, but not collapsed. There's brass cannon still buried in the sand that you can still kind of find. And of course, the walls of these forts are now furred with tropical vegetation and battered by over 3 centuries of weather. They are, I think, by all accounts, extraordinary places even now. And they are also monuments to a very specific commercial logic. 5 of the 6 Band Islands are actually sat very close together, near enough that a network of strategically placed fortifications can actually cover them all. The Dutch perceived this very quickly, and they acted upon it. 5 islands under Dutch guns meant 5 islands from which nutmeg moved exclusively through Dutch hands. The monopoly that was the whole point of this exercise began to take shape. But there was a 6th island, and its name was Run. And it lay roughly 10 miles from that main cluster of 5. So close enough to be part of the same archipelago, but far enough to sit beyond the reach of the Dutch fortifications. It's a small island, and in most respects, it's very unremarkable. But it grew nutmeg. And so long as Run remained beyond Dutch control, the monopoly was actually incomplete. An enemy holding Run could actually sell nutmeg outside Dutch channels. They could undercut Dutch prices. They could supply, rivals to the Dutch. And of course, that meant they could also fracture the elegant commercial structure that the VOC was so methodically constructing. So the English perceived this opportunity with what their rivals must have found infuriating clarity. They sailed for Run, and in a gesture that distinguished their methods from those, of the Dutch, they didn't build a fort. They actually negotiated with the people who lived there. A treaty was drawn up and signed, bringing the island formally under the protection of the English crown. So the flag of St. George flew over Run Island by the choice of its people. The man responsible for making that choice meaningful, for holding the island against what was about to come, was a English East India Company employee, a captain named Nathaniel Courthope. And the saddest thing about him is that he's been almost entirely lost to the popular history of empire. And I think that's an injustice worth correcting. And really interestingly, Russell Crowe has actually just bought the rights to a fabulous book that goes into the most immense detail about the island of Run and what took place, called Nathaniel's Nutmeg. Interestingly, Courthope's house, his original house, actually survives still in Cranbrook in Kent. It's one of those half-timbered Elizabethan manors, of the kind that England built in considerable numbers and now regards with considerable nostalgia. I love them. And standing outside it, I think what's astounding is that the man who lived in it would sail to the other end of the world, and he would play a role in events that would eventually reshape the entire map of North America. And that really kind of causes you to gasp just a little bit. But that lay ahead. First, he had to get to Run. So the voyage to the Band Islands was an education, I think, and the word that actually comes to mind is in suffering. It was an education in suffering. The Atlantic offered its particular torment in the doldrums, so those latitudes where the wind simply dies. And ships would have sat motionless in equatorial heat. Provisions would have dwindled, tempers would have shortened towards violence. Beyond the doldrums, if you survived it, came scurvy, the disease of long passages and insufficient citrus fruit, which would first of all strip a man of all his teeth. It would then mottle his skin with purple bruises, and it reduced very strong sailors to creatures barely capable of movement before it finally killed them. And of course, we all know now that this was caused by the absence of vitamin C. A deficiency so reliably catastrophic that scurvy actually killed more men in the service of the spice trade than storms and pirates combined. If scurvy was the slow killer, dysentery moved with considerably less patience. The bloody flux is what the sailors called it, and it was contracted from contaminated water, which swept through the ships with appalling efficiency. Sailors spoke of having to clench their teeth when drinking to filter out whatever had taken up residence in the casks, during the weeks at sea. You can only imagine how disgusting it would have been. And this, folks, is what the men who sailed for Nutmeg endured. These were the costs against which they set a markup of 60,000% and decided the arithmetic actually worked in their favor. And I have to say, the logic, such as it was, isn't entirely without merit. Alongside all of this moved a figure who warrants particular attention because he embodied the Dutch approach to commercial competition, I think, with a completeness that left absolutely nothing to ambiguity. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen was Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, and his portrait, I think, tells you almost everything that you need to know before you read a single word about this horrific character. He stares from the canvas with eyes of unsettling directness. It's the eyes of a man who has decided what needs to be done and has never subsequently troubled himself with any kind of doubt whatsoever. He was a Calvinist of the demanding variety, a man who framed every act of commercial aggression in the language of divine mandate, who preached sobriety and rectitude, and who had, among other recorded acts of governance, ordered the flogging of a local 12-year-old girl in the streets of Batavia, who eventually died. He definitely wasn't in the English mold, a man inclined to treaties. While the English actually sought arrangements with the peoples of the islands they coveted, Cohen actually operated on a very simpler principle. The islands should be taken. People who stood in the way of taking them would be killed or removed and put into slavery. And the details of that removal he regarded as administrative. The massacre that resulted from this philosophy lies just ahead in my account, so I will get you there. And it's not a pleasant story. It's, however, a necessary one because it explains why Run Island mattered so much and why Nathaniel's stand upon it would become one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of English commerce. The mortality figures alone, they should have ended any of these enterprises before they began. In the early decades of the spice voyages, only one ship in 3 completed the journey and returned home. Of the men who sailed, roughly 4 in 5 didn't live to see England again. Storms would have claimed some as well, but as I mentioned, disease took far more. The Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch accounted for others, and the arithmetic, well, it's not the kind that a prudent man dwelt upon too long before signing his articles, and walking up the gangplank. I honestly don't know whether I could have done it. The men that did sign nonetheless tell you more about the value of nutmeg than any price comparison could. Men measured the risk against the reward and conducted that the reward was actually worth it. And of course, they weren't wrong. They were simply, in most cases, unlucky. The captain under whom Courthope had actually sailed to the east with for the first time was actually one William Keeling. And he was the kind of officer whose instincts about managing men in extremity have since been entirely vindicated. And I like him a lot. When the doldrums would becalm a ship, and in one instance, he was becalmed off the coast of West Africa, so no wind to fill his sails. And with the heat pressing down, the ship going nowhere, Keeling actually organizes a theatrical performance. He dressed his crew in costumes. He assigned them parts. And there, on the mangrove shore of a West African anchorage, a country that had yet to be named, Shakespeare's Hamlet was performed by men who had put to sea in search of nutmeg. Courthope would need all such ingenuity, and I think even more, when he arrived on Run Island in 1616. He brought with him 2 ships and 38 men, and almost immediately the Dutch arrived on the horizon. And the disproportion, well, it wouldn't have been subtle. The VOC maintained dozens of ships in Banda waters and thousands of soldiers across its island fortifications. Against this, Courthope could set 38 men and 2 vessels, whatever cannon he could bring ashore, and the peculiar geographical advantage of an island that seemed designed by nature for defense. In this, he was lucky. Run is small. It's basically a couple of miles in width, perhaps a mile in length. But it's surrounded on most of its perimeter by cliffs of a height and steepness that made conventional assaults a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one. They were like the White Cliffs of Dover. However, there was one section, only one, where a landing might be attempted. So Courthope put his cannon exactly there. And when the Dutch came, and they came repeatedly with the persistence of men who could actually afford persistence, well, he turned them back at every avenue. A few well-placed shots across the bows of approaching vessels produced the desired effect. The ships withdrew, and the blockade continued. And so began the siege of Run Island. And it would last for an almost incomprehensible length of time, actually more than 4 years. The question, stripped of all diplomatic and commercial complexity, was simple. Could Courthope and his men endure longer than the Dutch had patience to maintain a blockade that cost them ships and men and resources every day it continued? And I have to say, the conditions on Run would have definitely not favored optimism. The island's vegetation was overwhelmingly nutmeg, which in the circumstances of men hoping to eat was more irony than sustenance. There was nutmeg, and there was nutmeg that you could prepare in various ways. But after a couple of months of eating nothing but nutmeg varieties, I imagine your patience and health would run very thin. Of course, water was another problem. Run had no natural spring. What the men drank was actually collected during the monsoon seasons in whatever vessels could be found. They would then hoard it, they would ration it, and they would worry over the dry months of what would happen. So the island was actually too small and too porous to hold what its defenders needed to survive. And of course, they only had one other provision, arrack. the fierce, raw-spirited liquid that was distilled from palm or grain that actually served throughout the East as both a currency and a consolation. Well, that was present in sufficient quantity to make the siege survivable, if not comfortable. And it did the work that alcohol has always done in the service of men trapped in difficult places. It blurred the edges of an otherwise unblurred situation. So about 8 or 9 months into this particular siege, men scanning the horizon from the cliff tops saw sails, English sails. And the ship that they saw was a supply vessel dispatched from the company's base at Bantam in Java, laden with provisions for them. Its hold reportedly contained, among other necessary things, 600 jars of arak, which would have struck the men in Courthope's condition as something close to, I don't know, a divine communication. They hadn't been forgotten. London knew they were there, and help was coming. The men on the cliffs would have given out a cheer that had in it everything that they had suppressed for months. Relief, hope, the simple animal joy of being remembered by the world beyond the horizon. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So the men on the cliffs watched the ship Solomon come towards them and felt, I imagine, for the first time in months, something that had been in short supply on Run Island. Hope. And of course, they then watched it die within an hour. From the east, a Dutch fleet appeared. Several vessels against one, all with the tactical advantage that several against one implies. The Solomon had no realistic choice. The engagement, such as it was, took place almost beneath the cliffs of Run itself, close enough that the men stranded on the island could actually observe every detail of what was happening and could do nothing whatsoever about it. The ship was boarded, it was overwhelmed and taken. Its cargo, all the provisions, the water, the 600 jars of arak, that had seemed from the cliff tops like the most welcome sight imaginable, well, all of it was transferred to Dutch vessels and carried to the other islands in the Banda Group. Not a single provision reached shore. And of course, the crew of the Solomon were taken prisoner. They were transported to one of the Dutch fortifications, Fort Revenge, a name that actually carried its own, editorial commentary, where they joined the growing population of men who had encountered the VOC's methods at close quarters and survived to regret the experience. A prisoner confined in the dungeons, and keep in mind these dungeons were built below ground, with just a top grate separating them from the ground surface. Well, a report from there actually requires none of my embellishment. I'll just read you what one of the man's diaries said. The dungeon was covered by a grating. Through the grating, the Dutch guards relieved themselves upon the men below. They pissed and shitted on our heads in this manner until such a time as we were broken up and unconscious. And I think it's a sentence that resists the usual historian's instinct to contextualize. Some things simply are what they are. The Dutch treatment of the prisoners and of the native populations of the islands they occupied, I think, was, in the language of the period, without mercy. In language that we would better use today, it was systematic degradation deployed as an instrument of control. And yet, as you read these diaries, history becomes rather less comfortable for those inclined towards a simple moral. The Dutch weren't uniquely monstrous. They were operating in an age of considerable general brutality. And the English, well, they weren't standing conspicuously apart from it either. In the India Office Archives in London, among the papers of the company's operations in the East lies the diary of one Edmund Scott, who was a factor. He was a merchant adventurer, if you like, stationed at the English factory in Bantam. And Scott was, by his own account, a capable man operating in very difficult circumstances. The native inhabitants of the area, not unreasonably resentful of foreign encroachment, upon their trade and their territory, actually made several attempts to burn the English factory to the ground. And during one such incident, Scott captured one of the native men involved. What follows in Scott's diary actually occupies 5 or 6 pages, and it's written with the flat, almost administrative calm of a man recording something he regards as, well, I can only say straightforwardly justified. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but I'll tell you what happened. He tore out the man's fingernails. He applied fire to the man's hands and armpits. He broke the man's bones. He then blew off portions of his body with dynamite. The prisoner, obviously still alive throughout, and then he was eventually taken outside and tied to a stake, and introduced into his wounds were the terrible white ants of the region, whose particular qualities in this context that Scott describes with a precision that I have to say suggests personal observation. The man then survived this for days, and then he died. Scott seems not to have regarded any of this as requiring particular explanation or apology. Effectively, he just records it. He's not confessing to an act of violence. History permits no straightforward heroes in this story, I have to say. The English and the Dutch were competing not merely for nutmeg, but for methods of asserting and maintaining dominance over places and people who had their own interests, their own claims, and their own capacity for resistance. Both sides suppressed that resistance by whatever means they found effective. The Dutch were, I think, on the available experience, rather more systematic about it. The English, on the other hand, weren't conspicuously reluctant when circumstances seemed to demand it. What I can say with something approaching genuine admiration is that Nathaniel Courthope, throughout all of this, held his position. He had watched the Solomon being taken within sight of the cliffs. He had watched his last clear hope of relief disappear into Dutch custody. He had seen what the VOC did with the men it captured. He knew that eventually he would run out of food, water, arrack, and will to survive. In October of 1620, after 4 years of siege, Nathaniel made the decision that eventually killed him. Intelligence had actually reached Run Island, suggesting that the native populations on one of the neighboring band islands were growing restless, that a generalized uprising against Dutch authority would be imminent. For him, this was the kind of news that a man in his position couldn't ignore. An insurrection among the Bandanese would transform the strategic situation. And it might, if properly encouraged, break the Dutch grip on this archipelago entirely. It was, at a minimum, the most significant development of his long and dwindling siege, and it demanded direct investigation. So he decided he would cross the channel by night. He would take his servant, a boy called William, and a lantern, and go quietly across the water to see what was happening. However, the Dutch had anticipated that move. The ambush was already in place when Nathaniel's lantern appeared on the dark water sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning. The Dutch waited with the professional patience of men who had chosen their ground and know their moment until the little boat was almost upon them, and then they opened fire. Nathaniel fired back. What followed was a running engagement on open water in the dark with sporadic, chaotic, and for a man in a small boat against a prepared Dutch position, essentially a hopeless fight. His gun eventually jammed. He threw it into the water with what I can only imagine as a gesture of considerable frustration and he found himself defenseless on the open sea with the Dutch closing in around him. They shot him multiple times. He was last seen falling into the water. His body was never recovered. There was no grave, there was no formal conclusion, no document recording what became of Nathaniel after the dark waters of the Banda Sea received him. He simply vanished. A man who had held an island against impossible odds for 4 years and 4 months, and who died in the dark without witnesses sympathetic enough to leave an account. The effect on Ron Island was almost immediate and complete. Every siege in the end is a contest of endurance, and every contest of endurance rests on leadership. The men that Nathaniel had kept going through the years of hunger, of thirst, disease, and the particular psychological torment of watching help destroyed within sight of their cliffs, well, I think they only endured because he endured. And without him, the calculation changed. Their supplies were exhausted. There was no prospect of relief. There was nothing left to hold on for. And so they didn't hold on. The Dutch took Ron Island within days, and they now possessed all 6 of the Banda Islands. The monopoly, well, it was complete. The entire global supply of nutmeg flowed through the VOC's warehouses and no one else's. It was what Jan Pieterszoon Cohen had always intended, and he had finally obtained it. He now, however, turned his attention to the Bandanese themselves. Cohen's position on the native populations of the island he controlled, well, it wasn't complicated by ambiguity. He had decided that they were, in his recorded phrase, an indolent people of whom little good could be expected, which was the language of a man of his particular convictions. It's the language reached for when he had already determined what he intended to do and required a justification arranged to follow on. And what he intended to do was remove all 15,000 of them. His method was systematic. The headman of the Banda Island, the leaders, the authority figures, the men around whom any future resistance might conceivably be organized, they were arrested. Their execution was delegated to Japanese mercenaries, samurai who were available for hire and who had made their way into the orbit of Dutch commerce as the VOC effectively extended its reach towards Japan. The Japanese recognized the opportunity in multiple directions. They served the VOC where the VOC required services that even its own soldiers found disagreeable to perform officially. Decapitation in quantity was one such service. The headmen were all executed. The remainder of the Bandanese population were disposed of according to circumstance. Some were killed, others were enslaved and transported across the VOC's enormous network, some actually reaching as far as the Cape of Good Hope, where their descendants would eventually form part of a community that still, in certain family histories, preserves a memory of the Banda Islands, which is quite incredible. You know, the population of those islands before Cohen's attention, as I said, numbered something the order of 15,000 people, men, women, and children. By the time he'd finished, fewer than 1,000 remained. It was, by any definition that the world has carried in any era, a genocide. Cohen, of course, didn't use that word. That word didn't exist at this stage, but the concept was available to him, and he employed it deliberately and without apparent moral difficulty. He had a rationale. The Bandanese were obstacles to the proper functioning of a commercial monopoly. He had a method: violence, on whatever scale the obstacle required. He also had a precedent once it was done. And precedent, in the hands of men like Cohen, has a way of becoming policy. The massacre of the Bandanese, well, I think that established a template, and it would be applied again and again. In 1623, on the island of Amboina, a VOC headquarters, a short distance north of the Banda Group, an island that grew cloves rather than nutmeg but served the same commercial purpose, there were 10 English traders. 10 men attached to the East India Company, conducting the modest business that the English operation in the East was by then reduced to conducting. And they had between the 10 of them approximately 6 muskets. The Dutch fort on Amboina was actually garrisoned by hundreds and hundreds of soldiers with artillery and fortifications, sufficient to repel any attack that the entire English East India Company could plausibly have mounted. And there was a notion that the 10 merchants with 6 guns actually posed a military threat to this installation. I mean, it was absurd. However, under torture, a Japanese man associated with the English traders confessed that precisely such an attack had been planned. And of course, we all know torture is an instrument for establishing truth that actually produces whatever the truth the torturer requires to hear. The confession was duly obtained, it was duly recorded, which is how we know about it, and it was duly acted upon. Jan Peterson Cohen wanted the English presence on Amboina eliminated. And he now had, in the form of a confession, extracted by agony from a man who would have said anything to make the agony stop, the justification that he actually required. The English traders were arrested, and what followed became known in England as the Massacre of Amboina, and it would echo through the Anglo-Dutch relations for decades to come. It would also become, in the fevered pamphlet literature of later years, a byword for Dutch treachery and English martyrdom, a story told and retold until it acquired the weight of national grievance. And what happened next to those 10 men reached England, and it didn't leave England quickly. The tortures were not improvised. The Portuguese Inquisition had developed and refined these methods in the previous century, and they had since traveled the same routes as the spices themselves. The Dutch effectively employed 2 principal techniques on the men of Amboina. The first was what we would now call waterboarding, though the 17th century had no such name for it. And what would happen is that a waxed canvas bag was tied over the prisoner's head, water was poured into the bag. As it rose towards the mouth and nostrils, the choice presented itself of either drink or drown. So the men drank, and they went on drinking and drinking, gallons of water, by the accounts that later reached England, until their bodies actually swelled to something grotesque, until the flesh itself seemed to repel against what was being done to it. And I tell you this because I think it's important that we know what took place in those islands under the name of spice acquisition. The second technique they used required fire. Candles were applied beneath the armpits, along the thighs and the legs, and the burning would have been very methodical. It wasn't punishment, or at least punishment wasn't its stated purpose. It was information retrieval. And of course, it continued with the English suspects until the confession came. They're recorded here because the outrage that they produced in England was very genuine, very sustained, and ultimately very consequential. And that's why I think it's important to actually record these events, because cause has effect. John Dryden, the foremost poet of his age, wrote a play about Amboina. It was performed in London, and it struck exactly with the chord its author intended. Anti-Dutch sentiment, already present in a trading nation that had watched its eastern ambitions systematically dismantled, hardened into something more durable, a grievance, a collective national patient. The English government, confronting the practical question of what to do about the massacre, concluded that there was very little that they could actually do about it there. The Dutch held the Banda Islands. Recovering them would require a naval expedition of a scale that no one was prepared to fund, and of course it could well fail. Protest was registered with the Dutch, compensation was demanded, and essentially nothing was obtained. The Dutch had won the Spice Islands, and the laws of commerce and military reality, they were not going to be repealed by diplomatic correspondence. England was actually left to make the best of its remaining options. And in this particular failure, in this expulsion from the trade it had originally intended to pursue, I think lay the seed of something that would eventually prove rather more valuable than nutmeg. because what it did was it forced the East India Company, which had been founded to trade with the East Indies, Indonesia, the Spice Islands, nutmeg and pepper, and all that kind of stuff. Well, it forced them out, and it forced them into India. So by the 1640s, with the Dutch firmly in possession of the archipelago and the English ambitions in those Spice Islands reduced to memories and grievances, the company merchants found themselves in India by default. This is the amazing thing. They established trading posts. They cultivated relationships with the Mughal Empire, then at the apex of its power and wealth. Across Bengal, 1 million looms were working, producing textiles of a quality and quantity that the European market couldn't get enough of. The company had come looking for spices, and instead they'd stumbled into one of the richest commercial relationships in the history of trade. It would take a little bit of time for anyone to recognize what they'd found. For the moment, it seemed like the consolation prize, but in retrospect, it was the main event. But that recognition lay in the future. For now, the Dutch sat in their Spice Islands and in Amsterdam, and they grew fat on nutmeg. It was in this atmosphere of accumulated grievance, Amboina, unavenged, Run Island, unavenged, unrecovered, Dutch commercial supremacy undeniable, that the affair of New Amsterdam became impossible to ignore. So the Dutch had established their colonial foothold in North America under the name of New Amsterdam, a settlement on the island Henry Hudson had discovered for them in 1609 at the mouth of a magnificent harbor. And while Europe slugged on with its Anglo-Dutch wars, this small colony had grown quietly into something worth having. Under one such peace treaty, Run Island had actually been formally returned to the English. The Dutch, having gone to considerable trouble and expense to take it, declined to hand it over, even though they said they would. And the English noted this, and they didn't like it. And they added it to this ever-growing account. James, Duke of York, a man whose other commercial enthusiasms included a prominent role in the Royal Africa Company, a company that was built on the slave trade, a monopoly that came with it, whose initials were actually branded onto the bodies of enslaved people, decided that the accumulated indignities required a violent response. Amboina, Run Island, both withheld, Dutch commercial arrogance on a dozen fronts, enough was enough. So he decided to send ships across the Atlantic, and New Amsterdam actually fell without a fight. The Dutch colony passed into English hands and was renamed for the man who had seized it, New York. The man who stood between the Duke of York's ambitions and the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam was Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of the settlement, a figure of considerable personal force, considerable personal obstinacy. And famously, he had a wooden leg that had replaced the one removed by a cannonball during an earlier campaign in the Caribbean against the English. But look, he was also a practical man, and the arithmetic of the situation didn't favor resistance. New Amsterdam wasn't the Banda Islands. There wasn't a large Dutch force there. It was a settlement on a swampy island producing modest quantities of furs and trade goods, protected by fortifications that couldn't seriously be described as adequate against a determined naval force. The Dutch government would have made the calculation that commerce would have demanded. Effectively, the colony wasn't worth the fight. Negotiations then convened at Breda, and the terms of an exchange were finally worked out. The Dutch would hold the island that they had always intended to hold, and its nutmeg would continue to flow through Amsterdam. The English would actually keep New Amsterdam, and it would be renamed in the honor of a man whose personal initiative had secured it, New York. I have to say, contemporary opinion wasn't kind to the English side. The Dutch had actually traded a colony that had never been particularly profitable for confirmation of their monopoly over the most valued commodity on earth. the English effectively had acquired what most people considered a very poor consolidation for the jewel of the Spice Islands. But, retrospect is a funny historical thing, and you have to say that the English got the last laugh, though it took a couple of 100 years for that joke to become apparent. The price of nutmeg didn't remain at 60,000% indefinitely. Nothing does. As the Dutch cut out the middlemen and spices became more reliably available, its price began its long decline towards something approaching reason. The nutmeg in your kitchen cupboard, available today for a few dollars at any supermarket, is at the end of a point process that began with the Dutch secured the Banda Islands and made the extraordinary ordinary. And the English, well, in the meantime, they had been quietly industrious. Seedlings from the Banda trees, carefully packed in their native earth, transported with more patience than any of the military expeditions the archipelago had ever witnessed, eventually found their way to India and then to the West Indies. The volcanic soil and particular microclimate that the Bandanese trees demanded, well, it actually did prove replicable, if not exactly. But the transplants took, they fruited. The monopoly that had been defended with massacres and sieges and the blood of over 10,000 Bandanese was gradually dissolved by the simple persistence of horticulture. Most of the world's nutmeg today originates in the Caribbean, actually on the island of Grenada, a small island in the West Indies, and it grows it in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to any merchant who had risked his life crossing the Indian Ocean in search of a few sacks of the stuff. What the story of the VOC and the East India Company ultimately describes, it isn't, despite appearances, a tale of spices. It's actually a tale of corporate power and what happens when commercial ambition is permitted, if you like, to operate without constraint. The Dutch East India Company raised capital on a scale previously unimaginable. It built forts, it raised armies, it negotiated treaties with sovereign states as an equal. It governed territories, administered populations, and of course it collected taxes and waged wars. Not in the name of the crown or republic, but in the name of its shareholders. It was a corporation with an army. And when the interests of that corporation come into conflict with the interests of the people who happen to live where the nutmeg grew, the corporation resolved the conflict with a thoroughness that left fewer than 1,000 of the original 15,000 Bandanese alive. Cohen's phrase, an indolent people of whom little good can be expected, it didn't die with the Bandanese. It became a template. It traveled with a commercial empire wherever empire went in the centuries that followed, and not just by the Dutch. The formula was the same each time. Identify the people whose presence complicates the commercial objective, describe them in terms that place them outside the circle of ordinary moral consideration, and then proceed. The story is 4 centuries old. The structure it describes is considerably more familiar. So the VOC is gone. Its cannon lie buried in the sand of the Banda Islands. Its forts are crumbling in the tropical vegetation. What remains there is a record. 5,000 voyages, more cargo than all its rivals combined, an empire built without ever quite admitting that empire was what it was building. And in the end, it all collapsed under the weight of corruption, overextension, and the slow erosion of the monopoly that had been its foundation. Manhattan, which the English acquired as the lesser half of a bad bargain, became the financial capital of the Western world. The street named for the defensive wall the Dutch built in New Amsterdam became the address of, well, one of the institutions that inherited the VOC's innovations and carried them forward into modernity. Some irony, folks, is too large and too intricate to be called irony. It's simply history. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepopublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, guys. Bye for now.